Today we're going to start our study on the patriarchs. And this study is from Genesis 12 to 24. What are the patriarchs? Patriarchs is just another word for fathers. The Israelites reckoned they had three patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The book of Genesis, from chapter 12 to Genesis 50, covers four personalities, not three. An additional one, Joseph. So we have the three patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, in this part of the book, and then we have Joseph. Strictly speaking, Joseph does not qualify as a patriarch. God did not speak to him directly as he did to the patriarchs, the other three. He only was led by God through dreams and interpretation of dreams. Now, in this way of studying, in this part of our study, we are going to look at the lives of these four men. So our focus now is changed. Earlier on in Genesis, we studied the universe, then the world for thousands of years. Now the spotlight is on one family, 4 generations of them. And the way God is going to teach us truth is by telling us about their lives. So as God tells about their lives, we study their lives. We are using a method of study called the case study method. Now today, when you go to a top university like Harvard and you enroll in an MBA course there, you study case studies. Case study of a successful CEO, or case study of a company, why a company does well, or why it does badly, or case study of a country. So we have found in the way of education, field of education, that case studies are a wonderful way to learn lots of layers of truth about something. You could study the case study in a very superficial way and see just some big truths. Then as you study it deeper, you see more truths. And then you can go very, very, very deep to study really tiny little, fine, very deep truths. So in other words, the same case study can be used by different students studying at different levels. So that's why the Bible is a book that people who are new Christians could study these 4 lives and learn something, or people that want to be scholars and study one aspect of Abraham's life and come to very deep truths. So at this point of our study, we are just going to look at some important truths in the lives of these 4 people. Now let's look at a time frame. The patriarchs, like Abraham, he lived at about 2000 BC. 2000 BC is the time when the great civilizations of the world came about. China, Indus Valley, India, Egypt, right? So basically after the Tower of Babel, they spread, they went to some rivers where there was fertile land, and then people started to build civilizations, all right? So 2000 BC, Abraham. Then we call that the age of the patriarchs. And 1500 BC, we call it the age of the prophets. People like Samuel would come in at this time. Then 1000 BC is the age of the kings. Of course, for the sake of remembering the P's, patriarchs, prophets, instead of saying kings, we say princes. The princes, 1000 BC. Saul, King David. Then we move on to the priest, 500 BC. Because at 500 BC, Israel was in exile. There were no more kings left, no more princes left. So the ones that the Israelites looked up to were the priests, right? Then we go to 0 BC, Christ comes. Okay, so there's a simple way to remember. If someone asks you, when did Abraham live? 2000 BC. When did David live? 1500, right? When did Samuel live? 1500 BC. When did King David live? 1000 BC. When did Elijah live? 500 BC. Okay, so you know that this gives you an easy way to remember. Not very accurate, but roughly. Now, why did God choose these three patriarchs? Were they perfect men? Not at all. Abraham lied twice, recorded anyway. Maybe many, many more times, so 2 recordings of him lying to the king about his wife. Sarah says, she's not my wife, she's my sister. And then knowing when he lied, the king would take his wife to be a mistress. That's not a very good thing to do. Isaac also lied exactly like his father to save his skin at the expense of his wife. And then Jacob, of course, is the worst of the lot. He deceives an almost blind father to get more inheritance from his father. That's not a very good thing to do. But nonetheless, God chose them. Now, you see, God has the right to choose. We call that the doctrine of election. So many people say, why? Why does God choose this person? Why does God not choose this other person? God has rights. Let me give you an example. For example, I, just as an ordinary human, I have rights. I go to a restaurant, I choose what I want to eat. Now, often people will ask me, why do you like to eat that? That's not very nice. I say, I like it. That's my choice. I go to a store, I buy a shirt, and somebody will say, eee, so ugly. I say, I like it. Right? So as a human, I have rights to choose what I like. Does not God have rights? Okay, so that's a doctrine of election. Now, these 3 men were not perfect men, but let me say something about them. They had amazing faith. You say, what is faith? Faith is not that optimistic personality that some people have. Some people seem to have this thing that, it will work out. Don't worry. They have faith that things would work out. That's not what it means. Faith here means faith in a promise given by God. For these 3 men, God had promised them that they would inherit a piece of land. Not themselves personally, but their descendants would eventually inherit a piece of land. They never owned a square foot of this land. Maybe Abraham had a little cave he bought for his wife Sarah. That's all he owned of this land. But he knew this land would eventually be his and his family's. Why? Because God said so. That's all. So faith is nothing about your personality. It's about depending on the promise of God. Okay, so when the word faith in the Bible is used, it simply means depending, trusting a promise of God. So the Bible says in Hebrews 11 of these 3 men, Hebrews 11 is the chapter on the heroes of the faith. It says these 3 men died in faith, never having seen the promise. Why did they believe it? Because God said so. Very much like, for example, me. I know I'm going to have everlasting life. How do I know that? Do I know what everlasting life is? No, I have no idea what everlasting life is. It's too long. My brain cannot picture so many years. Can I believe that I'm going to exist in a new heaven and new earth? I never seen this new heaven, new earth. But why do I believe it? God said so. That's good enough for me. All right? So faith is believing in a promise. That's all it is. Okay? Now, next thing is, why did God tell them they're going to this piece of land? What's so special about this piece of land? Now, this piece of land, let's call it the promised land, is strategically located. If you go to Atlas, you will see there are three continents, right? Asia, Africa, and Europe, somewhat joined together. And if you look at the hub of these three continents, you will see a piece of land which is Israel today. It's like a hub with three spokes: Asia, Africa, Europe. And so, if anybody wanted to go from Europe to Africa, he would have to pass this strategic piece of land. If he wanted to go from Asia to Africa, he would have to pass through this land. It is like you have to go through this place if you want to move from one continent to the other. Right? Now, at the time of Abraham, at the time of the patriarchs Israel in the Bible, the three populated continents were Asia, Africa, and Europe. Americas were very sparsely populated. Australia was very sparsely populated. So these three continents contain the bulk of the population of the world. And so, if anything wanted to travel from one place to another, this would be the strategic place, right? So, eventually, God's truth would come out from this place. And how's the best way to spread truth is start with a strategic location so that truth could spread to the gospel, eventually could spread to Africa, Asia, Europe, and it did, right? So this piece of land is strategically located, this promised land, because God wanted this place to be a place where truth is given, where truth can be shared. Now, if you look at Israel, it's a very tiny place, okay? It's about, the present size of Israel is about 30 times the size of Singapore, and Singapore is so tiny. Now, not only is it tiny, but it is a very compact piece of land. You have snow-capped mountains, there are deserts, there are deep depressions like the Dead Sea, one of the deepest depressions on Earth. Snow-capped mountains and deep depressions. There's all kinds of climate, all kinds of vegetation. In fact, at the time of Abraham and the Bible times, all kinds of animals there, right? So it was like a world in miniature, okay? So this is the promised land. And this is the stage at which we are going to see a lot of things taking place, okay? This strategic little piece of real estate is literally the stage for most of the things you're going to read in the Bible. Okay, let's now come to the life of Abraham. Chapter 12 begins the life of Abraham, so focus on one man now. Abraham was 75 years old when God spoke to him. He lived at that time in the city of Ur, U-R. Ur is in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the word meso means between. Potamia means the waters, a river. So this is, the word hippopotamus, animal that lives in the water, the river. Now, so Mesopotamia is the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Two massive rivers, okay? And very fertile land. If you check in Google, you'll find that Ur, at the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC, was a very sophisticated city. Amazing. There were brick buildings, nice houses, even running water at that time, 2000 BC. So at the age of 75, living in the prime city of the world at that time, God says to Abraham, leave your city, go to this land I'm going to show you. You've never seen yet. What? At 75, you call Abraham out from this beautiful place at this age to go to a land he's never seen, to live in tents for the rest of his life, And yet, you know what Abraham did? He obeyed God. God said, go, he went. Now that is amazing. And then immediately in the second verse, that was the first verse I just spoke about. Genesis 12 verse 2 begins, God says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. And I will bless you to be a blessing to many other nations. I hope you see the word I will 3 times in Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3. I will. And later on, God adds, I will give you this land, this promised land. Okay? Now, this is what we call in Bible a covenant. It is like a king, a very strong king, going to a smaller kingdom and telling the kingdom, hey, come into agreement with me. I will protect you. I will provide for you. And all you have to do is obey me. Okay? So that's what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement between 2 parties, but not 2 equal parties. One superior party and one inferior party. Technically, a marriage in almost all cultures in the world are covenants. Not 2 equals coming together is what modern people think. Marriages traditionally have been a man taking a wife. A man saying to a lady, I will provide for you. I will protect you. And the condition is you will be my loyal wife. That is the condition. All right? So you are going to see a covenant, and you're going to see many times God makes a covenant with Abraham, then he makes a covenant with Isaac, he makes a covenant with Jacob. All right? Basically, I will be your God. You will be my people. Okay? So this is a covenant that God made with Abraham. I will. Like a marriage. Man says, I will. I will. Okay? Now, in a marriage, we have a token of a marriage. I wear a wedding ring. This reminds me I am married. The token for God's covenant with Israel is circumcision. The skin of the flesh is cut off, and every time a Israelite boy stands up to urinate, he is reminded he is in a covenant with God. He has to obey this God. All right? So this reminds me, circumcision is the token of the covenant that Israelites had. Very important to them. And then as we go on in Genesis chapter 12, shortly after this, Abraham builds an altar. What does it mean to build an altar? It means he sacrificed. All right? Don't build an altar for nothing. You build an altar to sacrifice an animal. And Abraham built an altar, and the Bible tells us 3 times he built an altar and he sacrificed an animal. That was his way of worshiping God. He probably had learned it from Abel, the son of Adam. Okay? And you know, almost every culture has an altar and a sacrifice. Almost every culture. When I went to China, I went to the Temple of Heaven. Very interesting place. A lot of symbolism of the Bible there. The roof is 3, number 3, and then there are a lot of number 12s around. And then there was a very significant altar made of stone. And then I asked the guide, what is this? He says, oh, this is where the emperor would offer a bullock for the people. The emperor's job really was not to make laws. The emperor's job, number 1 job, was to offer a sacrifice to the God of heaven. All right? So that the God of heaven would be pleased with China and bless China with good crops, etc. Okay, so every culture has this altar and sacrifice. They all probably learned it from this ancient ancestor of ours called Abel. Right? So now we see another interesting thing. Almost immediately after he's on the covenant with God, he's built an altar to worship God. He encounters a famine. Oh my goodness. I'm living nicely in Ur. There is no famine in Ur because Ur is between two massive rivers that never dry up. And now I come to this covenant with God and I face a famine, no food to eat. You see, this is very important for us to understand because there's so much health and wealth theology being taught nowadays that tells us the moment you come into a relationship with God, everything will be well. You will have health and wealth. Now, I'm afraid the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible now tells Abraham, you're going to be through a famine. Wow. And you know what they did when they had a famine in the promised land? They ran down to Egypt. Okay? Because in Egypt is not rain fed. A famine is really caused by no rain. Egypt is river fed, the Nile, and the Nile never dries up. So you'll find they run down to Egypt. And when Abraham runs down to Egypt, he realizes that he's got this pretty wife of his, Sarah, and she's so beautiful that, it's a way of the Egyptians to recommend any beautiful girl to Pharaoh to be taken into his harem, among his concubines. And so Abraham realizes that and says, hey, Sarah, tell them you're not my wife. If they know you're my wife, you know what Pharaoh's going to do? He's going to kill me and take you. So just say you're my sister. And that way, I will survive. But in that way, Sarah will end up in a harem of Pharaoh. You see, so Abraham wasn't that perfect man that we think he was, okay? But nonetheless, he had something very special called faith. He was willing to leave at 75, go to this place, live in a tent for the rest of his life because he had faith in a promise of God. And God counts faith as something very important, okay? To depend on God and trust God is the most important thing a human being can have. All right, so we go on to look at the life of Abraham very quickly. We don't have to go through every story because this is not a PhD study, a case study. So, along the way, God promises Abraham and Sarah that they would have an offspring, a child, a son, to inherit that promised land. But after 10 years, no son came. And so Sarah loses her patience and she tells Abraham, God, I think, forgot about us. Go into my Egyptian slave, have relationships with her, and get a son through her. Because Abraham's faith had failed, and Abraham failed as a husband to take a stand, just as Adam failed as a husband to take a stand. And he obeyed his wife, so to speak. And he had sexual relationships with Hagar, and a child called Ishmael was born. Now, this is quite a significant event in world history up till today. Ishmael is the ancestor of the Arabs. Okay? And when Ishmael was in his mother's belly, Hagar's belly, God said, this child of yours will be a multitude, will be a great nation. That has come to pass. Today, the Arab nation is 400 million strong. That's a big family, 400 million. One of the biggest families in the world today. Interestingly enough, The prophecy of God on this child in Genesis 16 verse 12 says, he will be a wild man. That's the King James translation, wild man. But in other translations, more accurately, it says, he will be a wild donkey of a man. Because the word actually in Hebrew is he will be a wild donkey. Now, a wild donkey in the time of Abraham was a untamable animal. Nobody can tame a wild donkey. Horses, easy. Tameable, not a wild donkey. All right, so two prophecies. He'll be a huge nation and he'll be a wild donkey of a man. And the prophecy goes on to say, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. In other words, he will always be at war. Now, I think this prophecy, to my mind, is fulfilled. A massive nation of people who always seem to have some conflict one with another, right? But let's look at how this sin of Abraham, sin of faithlessness, sin of listening to his wife when he should be telling his wife what is right, what it has caused for 4,000 years. 2000 BC till now, 2000 AD, the offspring of Ishmael and the offspring of the half-brother Isaac have been fighting together for 4,000 years. Hardly imagine a family feud lasting 4,000 years. That's a fact. Up to today, the Arabs are trying to destroy the Israelites. Okay? So you see how one mistake can have very major long-term repercussions, especially mistakes of lack of faith. Then we go on to see another interesting story in his life. Where we're skipping a lot. Another interesting story is the story of Sodom. Lot had a nephew, Abraham had a nephew called Lot, and Lot decided to stay in the city of Sodom. Nice city, in a prosperous, fertile land, but it was a very wicked city. Today we have the word sodomy. Sodomy is male homosexuality. And the word comes from the city of Sodom. Sodom was horrendously immoral. If you read this Genesis 19, you cannot believe there is a city like this, where men, when you bring a guest to your house, men come knocking at the door and say, bring the man out, we're going to have sex with him. All right? I mean, even today, there's no city as wicked as Sodom. But can you imagine the wickedness? We think wickedness is something new. It's always been around since the fall of Adam. And Abraham was told by God that God was going to destroy this city. And Abraham said, God, are you going to destroy this city of wicked people? There are good people in there. If there are 50 good people, how can you destroy it? And God said, 50? I won't destroy it. Then Abraham continues to bargain because his nephew lives there, and his nephew and his children, his family live there, his nephew's family. And Abraham bargains with God, what about 45? Will you destroy 45 righteous men? Will you destroy? God said, no, I won't. And he bargains down to 10. And God's very patient. God says, 10 men? I won't destroy. And then the Bible says something very interesting at the end of Genesis 19. And it says, God left when Abraham stopped communing with God. In other words, when Abraham said to God, if there are 10 righteous men, please don't destroy the city. And God said, I won't. And then Abraham stopped at that point instead of asking for 5 righteous men. And maybe this city would have been spared. But Abraham stopped praying. Now, what lesson can we learn from this case study? You know, God is often far more merciful, far more patient than us. The problem with us is we lose our patience, our faith very quickly. We pray and pray and there's no result, you know what we do? We just stop. Actually, God is saying, why did you stop? So can I encourage you, when you pray for something you feel really led to pray for, just keep praying. Don't quit. God doesn't answer immediately. Okay? Now, so we see in the city of Sodom these awful things, and then we see one highlight, so to speak, and I call it the highlight of Abraham's life. And that is found in Genesis chapter 22. Finally, Abraham has a son now. His son is growing up nicely. His son's name is Isaac, and is his only son, not counting Ishmael, is not his son from a illegitimate relationship. This is his only real precious son whom he loves. And one day God says to him, hey, Abraham, offer Isaac up for a burnt offering. Whoa! A burnt offering means you put him on the altar, just like all the other animals you put on the altar. It's firewood, and just burn him as an offering to God. Okay? Now, Abraham obviously loves his son, and furthermore, Abraham knows the promise that God gave of the land has to go to his son. This is his only son. If I kill this son and burn him, then I'm destroying the promise of God. But the Bible tells us, God said, just go, bring your son to Moriah. Bring your son to Moriah, Mount Moriah, and offer him there. Now, the word Moriah may not be familiar to you, but Moriah today is called Calvary. It's called Golgotha. This is the same mountain where 2,000 years later, the Lamb of God was crucified for us, right? So God told Abraham, bring Isaac to Moriah and sacrifice him there. You know, the amazing part in Genesis 22 says, Abraham woke up early that morning. He heard the order from God, go to Moriah and sacrifice your son. He woke up early in the morning to go. Wow. This man's faith is amazing. Can't believe that. Imagine God asked me to do that. I would try to delay it as long as possible, hoping God would change his mind. All right? And then it goes on to say, it was a 3-day journey. He woke up early, and for 3 days he brought the firewood, he brought the knife, he brought Isaac, he brought a few of his servants with a donkey carrying the firewood to go to this mountain. For 3 days he did it. You know, 3 days is so many chances to change your mind, but he didn't. Can you imagine what went through his mind? 1,000 horrible thoughts, but one thing sustained him. God said, I will give you the land. Now, to you and your ancestors, to your descendants. But this is my descendant. Even if I kill him, maybe God's going to do something. I don't know what it is. He's never heard of resurrection yet, right? Anyway, the story goes on to say, finally he reaches Moriah, Mount Moriah, builds the altar, puts the firewood, and then he straps Isaac down on the altar, ready to kill him and then burn him. Wow. Some things crossed my mind. Why did Isaac not protest? Is it, some people say maybe he was a little boy, he couldn't struggle with his father. I tell you, even if he was a 5-year-old boy, he was going to yell and scream. No mention of that. Many people like to believe Isaac was a boy, like 12 years old at the most. But the Jews believe Isaac was an adult. And they come to the conclusion from the next chapter, Genesis 23. Moriah, the story is Genesis 22. Genesis 23, immediately the first verse says, and Sarah was 127 years old and she died. Now, if Sarah is 127, then Isaac is 37 years old, because Isaac was born when Sarah was 90. Now, the Jews believe he was 30 years old when he was brought up to Moriah. Whatever it is, whether he's 12 years old or 30 years old or 37 years old, it doesn't matter. Why was he just lying there? I am still puzzled. Okay? But anyway, as Abraham was about to stab Isaac and offer him the sacrifice to God, kill him first, then burn him, he hears a voice. Abraham turns around, and the voice says to him, don't touch Isaac, don't kill him. God has provided a ram for the sacrifice. And Abraham turns around and he looks and he sees in the thicket, thorny bush, a ram caught by his horns in the thorns, and he cannot escape. Wow! And Abraham's so thankful. God has provided a ram, and he freed up Isaac, put the ram on the sacrifice, and offered that sacrifice of a ram, a substitute for Isaac. And then he called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, which means God will provide. We always hear the term Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. Do you realize it came from this occasion where God provided the most important thing of all, his only begotten Son, to be our lamb or ram for our sacrifice? Right? So can you see here a type of the gospel? To me, it's perfect type. Wow. Abraham, like God the Father, giving his only beloved son. Abraham gives Isaac, God the Father gives Jesus his only beloved son. Jesus on the cross, no protest. Unbelievable. And then Jesus on the cross, a crown of thorns. Wow, why the crown of thorns? Because there was a ram caught in the thorns by his horns. He was stuck in the thorns. Can you see the picture? And that ram substituted for Isaac. So many hints of the event 2,000 years later. Now, there are several questions probably in your mind. How did Abraham have such faith? Is it natural to have such faith? Maybe he had more faith than others. But I believe Abraham was already somewhat prepared by God. Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 when they had a child. Now, obviously at that time, Abraham was way past having a child. Sarah was definitely not beyond childbearing age. And yet when God told them, I will give you a child, they were miraculously provided with a life. Where did this child come from? Not from me, not from Sarah. We both are not capable of producing a child, but God gave a life. So I think when he went up to Moriah, he already knew this God. He had idea of who this God was. This God is amazing. He can give life. And if I stab my son Isaac, I don't know what he will do, but he can give life, because Isaac had to inherit the promised land. So he couldn't figure it out, but he knew God can do things he can't figure out. You see, that is, I think, the way God prepared him. And maybe he had told this story to Isaac about how Isaac was born when he was 100 and his mama was 90. He said, Isaac, you're not from us. You're a gift from God. God does amazing things. We must trust this God. You see, to know God is the most important thing. And I believe Abraham and Isaac knew God because, they had this understanding of God. That's why we're studying this beautiful book, not so much to see what promises I can get, but who God is. And when we know who our God is, our life will never be the same. We will not be shaken, will not be troubled, not by events, because our life is anchored on who God is. So I hope this very quick study of Abraham's life will give us beautiful seed truths of who this God is and what he will yet do for us at Calvary.